So welcome to this online platform. This is our first virtual 101 talk for after a long time. Now, dear colleagues, friends, students, and researchers, good morning. Sir, you cannot see them, but they're there. We have arranged a projector and our students are here with us. Some of our researchers too are here. So, this is Professor Gautam Buddha. He been the chairperson of Bankura Christian College, which is of the English department of Bankura Christian College. And sir, can you hear me?
Yes, sir can hear us, but we cannot hear sir.
Sir, we cannot hear you.
Yes, okay.
Yes, sir, and he is our senior most professor, and he has edited multiple books, and he is a very good teacher. What to say about him, Professor Gautam Buddhushural? He has been one of the guiding people of this department. Now, good morning, and we welcome you all today to the address to be delivered by Professor GJV Prasad on translational transactions. Professor Prasad is a poet, novelist, translator, author of a cookbook, which is now out of print. I want to read that. And yes, in previous avatar, he was discussant of life and literature, a radical classroom teacher of English studies at JNU. Now, this has been conceived as inaugural to a series on trans effects, to which is thinking towards, and it belongs to the set of colloquium lectures, which has been hosted now for several years by this department. So Professor Debnaran Bandyopadhyay, who is VC of our university and Professor of English Studies, was supposed to have been here, but due to some extreme emergency or inconvenience, he cannot be here. He was looking forward to being here and to listening to you indeed. Now he is not here, but we remember him, and he's an explorer in Australian and Buddhist studies, and he's a scholar of Greek and Sanskrit. And however, we cannot request him to say anything as of now. Now, I would request Professor Shubir Kumar Roy, who is a professor of law and at present registrar of our university, who has taken time out of his rather extreme schedule in these intense climate and times to please say a few words on this occasion. Professor Shubir Kumar.
Thank you, Professor Dipshita. First of all, my heartfelt thanks to Department of English and all my colleague over here, all the academicians present in this virtual platform, all the students, and of course the resource person who is present over here. What I heard, that is the topic of the discussion, is about the translational transaction. Really, it's a very proud moment that the Department of English has organized this sort of the lecture seminar, whereby certainly the students, and not only the students, all the academicians connected with this, they will be able to explore this very area. But I think about this topic. Actually, I don't have much idea about this, but transaction, what it reflects, that is a kind of buying and selling, and it involves a series of activities. And of course, when we talk about translational, then naturally the matter involves the translation. and the translation of the literature, it certainly involves the, the translator and the source text. Then naturally a kind of relationship exists over there as a consumer and buyer. So naturally, in the field of literature, perhaps, I don't know because myself, I'm not from the field of literature, but what I can assume that in this, basically in this global era, when the whole world is in our fist, so naturally it certainly involves the global literature too, and maybe somehow it establishes a correlation between the literature, culture, language, and nation. And of course, it affects the various facets of the economy and certainly influences the financial, geographical, cultural, social aspects, and perhaps somehow touches the power relationship what persists in the society. And trans, transnational aspect, translational aspect has, of course, the transnational theory, it has also a relationship. And to my mind, when we talk about translation, as myself, I am from the legal field, it certainly affects the intellectual property rights. It has a dimension towards the copyright, the aspect of artificial intelligence when we are talking about, and when we know that the literature and books, it's transforming into e-books, then naturally the artificial intelligence, the issue of artificial intelligence also comes within this domain. So I'm sure when the resource persons who are present over this virtual field, all the eminent academicians are over here. Today, perhaps Professor, renowned Professor Prasad, he will deliver the lecture. So I'm sure that whatever the
Yes.
deliberations will take place over here, that will enhance the cognitive faculty of all the persons present in this virtual platform. With these words, thanks to all of you.
I thank you, Professor Roy. Over to Professor Gautam Buddha Shural. Would you please say a few words, sir?
Okay, sir, a very good afternoon. A very warm. Okay. So, can you hear me?
Sir.
Yes, yes. So, a very warm welcome and a very warm good afternoon. Although it is raining here, sir, it's drizzling. We are here to actually attend your virtual lecture, and Ipshita will definitely say a few words about you. We have heard so much about you, and I do not know, I have no words to welcome you, such an illustrious personality. But then Ipshita just told me in the morning that you have to say a few words to welcome sir. So naturally, it's a great privilege for us that we have today you with us. Our students are also attending the lecture offline and online, and our research scholars are also in the double mode. So I think, sir, this is going to be a very enlightening and enlivening session for us. And just to, sir, begin,
Indian writing in English is your specialization.
Yes, Indian writing in English is, as I'm a teacher, as a teacher, it is my specialization. As a scholar, definitely I worked on British literature. But then as I teach, I always prefer to teach Indian English literature. And sir, one very naive question, you can say that, as you will be talking on translation, I think definitely your lecture will address all these issues. But for me, a very naive question is when I try to translate and when I retranslate, sometimes actually connect translation theory with actual translation. When we read essays on translation theory, when we try to teach essays on translation theory and or theory as such, and we actually try to relate, it is my personal experience, when I try to relate what is the relationship between theory, translation theory, and translation as such, that actually confuses me at times. So I think, sir, just as a point to begin, I just put before you this question, and I hope, I'm sure that you will definitely, in course of your lecture, will address this issue. And I now, sir, hand the mic over. There is no microphone, but the virtual one. I hand it over to Ipshita to give a formal introduction about you, sir, so that our students also know the stature of this illustrious personality. Thank you, sir.
I think he's already done it.
So you cannot see our students. And I do not have the technological knowledge to right now show them to you. One has to just then turn around the computer, but I don't want to do that. You know, it is already too fragile.
Right.
And the technological setup. Now, Professor Prasad, I do not know about forms, but how do I introduce him as a scholar, as an explorer, as a thinker of reading range, who has edited and authored seminal books and papers in domains ranging from Indian writing in English to disability studies, Indo-Australian connections to India in translation and translation in India, on reading Dalit along with John Osborne and Khushwant Singh. Some of his books, some of the covers we had featured in that poster include Reading Dalit Essays on Literary Representations, Disability in Translation, The Indian Experience, Violets in Crucible, Translating the End, Writing India, Writing in English, Literature, Language, Location, or The Lost Temper, Critical Essays in John Osborne's Look Back in Anger. Yet he is also a poet who moves and makes, a translator to Arcadius in his 2021 book of poems, This World of Mine, and translator, creator of, sir, you were talking about theory and praxis. He has translator, creator of A Red-Necked Green Bird, a haunting book which came out in 2021 too, based on Tamil author Ambai's heave of short stories in Tamiz that has now won the Sahitya Academy Award, the Tamil original. The book features lines like a love that ungendered each other, or a loudly cawing, screeching murder of crows, among other unsettlings. For years, Professor Prasad has taught us a course on translation. Translation termed The Art of Failure in the film The Lost Daughter by Maggie Gyllenhaal, or as embodying the ethics of attention and labor of unfinished engagement with foreign and plurals by Paul Ricoeur in Philosophy of Translation. As teacher in classrooms, this is the role that I find most haunting and transformative for us. You have transformed many of us, and made us think that we could create, think and write, and retained a depth, dark enigma. You have been a person who can kindle the radioactive element in a student. That is, you make her into an unmake of possibilities. He gave a lot of confidence. You know, really, yeah. This is a gift that beautifully beholds a teacher and gathers within, ripens a student with time, You're the most radical, I told you before, that is root revising teacher I have known in JNU and my life till date. The most radiant source, a gather and grow of self as constellation. On that note, dear sir, I welcome and invite you to please deliver your address on translational transactions. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Ikshita, by introducing me like this, has made my work very difficult. The only thing I can say is that I hope I can inspire you all by simply being so bad that you can think you can be better than me easily. And that's a good role for me to play in any case. The registrar, when he began, he actually stole my thunder because he explained translation and transaction in legal terms, which is one of the things I was going to do. And he really took away my abstract in a certain sense. The question asked of me about translation theory and practice again puts me in the spot to kind of on this and gives me a way of puts me on the spot and asks me questions which are not that easy to answer, and therefore I'm triply challenged already now to deliver something that is of some interest and use to you, because these three people's interventions will be there in front of you. You'll be thinking about it and saying, oh, Professor Prasad is not answering or engaging properly with any of this. When I accepted Ipshita's invitation, I should say the head of department's invitation, tend to think of students as forever students, which is completely wrong. She's a colleague and a very esteemed colleague and somebody I admire, whose work I admire. When she asked me to deliver this lecture, I could not say no because of who she is and because of the university where I know others as well, including the Vice Chancellor. So I said yes. And when she asked me for a title, because this was in the trans series and I was talking about translation, I said translational transactions. And she said, okay. I didn't even know what I meant. So I had to think about it later and think, why did I say it? Just alliteration, just because it came together? And I said, no, but every act is a transaction. So it's not a bad thing. I can talk about it. And but I had agreed to talk to students. So if my level, if others expecting a very theoretical engagement, they may be disappointed. I'm going to be talking from my experience of translation. I'm going to be talking from my understanding of translation, what translation involves, and I will try and keep within the time frame of 45 minutes. I always begin my lectures on translation with usually a phone in my hand, because what else do you have nowadays? To say, when people think of translation, they think in mathematical or physics terms. That is, an object going across space and time, moving across space and time, which at the end of that movement is the same object, where all its molecules are in the same relationship with each other as they were before. So this is what we expect of translation, that the translation will be exactly the original. If the translation was exactly the original, it would not be a translation, right? So obviously we know there are things that happen. It's the physics definition does not work for any linguistic language transaction. A translation going across languages will not be the same as the original. Having said that, I must also, because we started with legal definition, let me also go to the financial definition of translation and transaction. In translation versus transaction in finances, what happens is that when you talk about transactions, the problem with a loss or a gain that may happen in a transaction depends on when when the transaction is done and when it is going to be implemented. So from the time the transaction negotiations take place to the time it's implemented, there may be a loss. There may be a loss. So the money value may go down. There may be a loss or there may be a gain, right? So that is, the transactions can, the time lapse in transaction can lead to certain things. But in terms of translation, they talk about translation as something in terms of exchange value, in terms of money. So if I say this asset is at which it has so many, its value is so much in dollars, which in a sense is so many rupees on this day, but 3 days later the value may be very different. So the value of the asset goes down, the value of the asset goes down, or the value of the asset goes up. So this is translation. So they talked about transaction and translation costs and all that, which is finance. We're not interested in it. I just want to put it there. I want to put it there that that translation and transaction are words used in very many fields. Translation is also used in biology, as many of you must have realized during the COVID pandemic that we're still in. That when proteins are produced through interaction with the RNA is translated into protein. The RNA is translated into protein in the cell. That is again translation in biology. That is called translation. And you take vaccines which inhibit translation, which inhibit translation into protein. So this word everywhere translated means, in a sense, a certain change, a certain impact that happens, right? A change that happens, and it has an impact on you in these areas. In terms of literature, obviously it has, an impact in sort of a new product is in front of you, a new book is in front of you, a new poem is in front of you, a new short story, whatever is in front of you. We know, of course, how translation, and transformation work in the kitchen. We know about all this, right? So by the time I'm finishing, you realize I'm giving translation a very broad definition. I don't have to struggle to retain it within literature or literary translation. I'm thinking of translation in a very broad term, as terms that may also sound too vague and not right, and you have at liberty to tell me that, right? So it's like saying when Rushdie talked about translated men. We know that we are all translated people because colonialism has translated us, Western influence has translated us, globalization has translated us. We listen, there is a whole generation I know which is turned to Korean dramas, which my generation isn't. There is the people who listen to Western music, and that is their music. Our dress sense, our fashion comes from everywhere. So, in a sense, we are in our body, in the way we decorate our body, in the way we dress our body, we show how translated we are, right? In just this itself, in what we eat, if everybody is eating pizzas, where they're coming from, burgers, so in what we eat, everything changes. In everything, there is a transaction cost involved, right? Things change you, they change themselves, and there are things that disappear like something. But to understand even better what transaction can mean, because transaction is any act or activity between two people or two objects, as I was saying, in terms of biology, if you want, or between two objects or two people, where that interaction, that communication act, has influences both of them, has changes both of them, has impact on both of them. So let's think of, and we know this, that we are involved in all kinds of transactions. I'm still not getting to translation directly. We all have talked to, let's say, various kinds of transactions in our life, right? I'm going back to something which is from a long back. And when I first talked about it in translation, and I was told it's not translation at all. And I was saying, no, it's not. It's transaction of a certain kind. And this was my thinking of my grandmother talking to her neighbor. My grandmother, this is in Delhi. Both of them are South Indians. My grandmother knows no Telugu. My neighbor knows Telugu but knows no Tamil. My grandmother speaking Tamil to her Telugu neighbor, and the Telugu neighbor replies in Telugu to my grandmother. And they would carry on conversations like this. I asked my grandmother once, and why don't you learn Telugu then? And she said, I'm too old to learn a language. Right? I said, you never are. But why don't you? She says, why? I only talk to her. And I said, so? She says, I understand her completely. And she understands me completely. So I kind of, thought what's happening here is translational. Though people won't call it translation because something's happening, a transaction is happening, which in its nature is translational because they're talking to each other about their daily life, about whether the maid has come or not, what the price of something is, and they are giving information to each other, which can change the way they look at somebody, which can change the way they look, what they buy, what they intend to buy, etc., and across languages. Across language, each one speaking a different language altogether, but there is a transaction and a translation happening. So I've always thought about this business of languages, you know, being in proximity to each other. Here, of course, artificial, because in Delhi, it's not as if Telugus and Tamils live together. But there are places where people actually speaking different languages live together. And Delhi is a place where people speaking very many different languages live together. Telugu Tamil was very restricted thing, but if you think in terms of Punjabi, Hindi, Tamil, Bengali, you name it. And there are people in communities, in government colonies, in private colonies, people speaking different languages who live together, who interact with each other, and influence each other's languages. Where you are, very often, if you're a Bengali elsewhere, if you're a Tamilian elsewhere, and elsewhere by mean from your town of your village where you come from, the language will change. The way you see the world in that language will change. Things will start meaning different things to you. So as this contacts between languages, contact between cultures, is always transactional, because as it changes you, translates you, you also translate that language, and you also have an impact on people around you. You can have people around the country, except in parts of the Northeast, who go into a restaurant expecting to eat a South Indian dosa or a North Indian bhature chole. So in a sense, what happens is that their attitude to food changes, their understanding, their way of expressing that, and the food also changes itself, because when you get keema dosa or you get cheese dosa, the dosa has changed. The dosa has changed, and dosa has become dosa. In any case, the way you pronounce it has changed. Vada becomes vada. So everything changes in this. There is a translation that's happening. There's a transaction that's happening. There is money also that's changing hands. All kinds of translations can be seen in terms of transactions and in terms of the kind of influence in change that affects us fully, right? That affects life around us. So this happens in just living in a multicultural, multilingual country like India. We are in translational spaces without even recognizing them as such, without even saying that I am translating all the time and I'm being translated all the time, and I'm having impact on others and they're having an impact on me. We do this without even recognizing this. Some of the translations that have happened to our food, because this dosa business is simple, but some we don't even recognize. Even if we know it, we will not, we kind of, for example, I'm talking to people in Bengal, and in Bengali cuisine, and the kind of fight people have about biryani, for example, the potatoes in the biryani, how much you do with aloo posto, you name it, you have potatoes in it, and potatoes are not native to our country. So how did it become such a large part of our cuisine? So much so it's seen as integral to it, right? So this is a huge translation that's happened in colonial times. Potatoes, tomatoes, chilies, Indian food without chilies, but chilies are not Indian. Black pepper was. Chilies come from elsewhere. So it's interesting that there is, and these are all part of transactions if you think about it, because these are all come from the colonial times. These are all, part of that exchange, and you're buying goods, selling goods, sending stuff across to India, taking stuff from India. This is part of that exchange completely. And what it has done is to have completely changed what we eat and our attitude to what we eat across the country. Certain things just traveled so much that they become part of cuisines everywhere, like the chili, right? It's like potatoes, most places in this country. Of course, there was an active governmental intervention in making potatoes available to everybody later in independent India. But to make it a cheap, easily available vegetable, the kind of research work done, etc., but and encouragement to farmers to grow it. But again, transactions, but translational transactions, because they completely translated our food around the country. And if you don't see that, if there are any Tamilian in this, you'll realize, because in Tamil Nadu, when I was growing up, no, you won't realize, you're too young. When I was growing up in Tamil Nadu, potatoes were very expensive. So that when you had a feast or when you had a guest, you cooked potatoes because you gave them something expensive. By that time, potatoes were very cheap in the north. It was, as I said, part of everything in the north. Even if North Indians make bitter gourd, they'll put potatoes in it. Anything, potatoes in it, right? So it's cheap. It augmented, it was nutritious, as one of the health ministers in independent India said, much better than anything else. So there was a huge push to make potatoes available and cheap at that point of time, which finally resulted in becoming cheaper in the south as well and more available in the south as well. That period is gone. But at that time, it was expensive. And I can't believe that, now when potatoes become expensive, you think there's something wrong with the economy. But at that point of time, it was simply not available. So when you look around at how a push, a certain kind of transaction can actually be translational. But the very act of translation involves a lot of transactions. In any case, even literary translation, as you may realize, already having listened to the registrar. Okay. So what do I mean by that? Oh, by the way, because I was talking about cuisine, I must quickly say that Ipshita said my book is out of print. You can still get it on Flipkart so far as I can see. Okay, but that's different. It's called South Indian Vegetarian Kitchen. Just to let you know that I know what I'm talking about in terms of cuisine. Having said that, when you translate a book or a short story, a poem by yourself, I'm not even talking about commissioning, because that the transaction becomes very clear. Because if a publisher approaches you, which is how it usually happens. If an author approaches you or a publisher approaches you for translating, the terms of transaction are worked out very clearly, or need to be worked out very clearly. You will translate this book by this time, for which you will be paid this much money. Literary translation. For non-literary translation, again, you will translate this text, this agreement, this tender document, or whatever. You will translate it by this time, from this language into this language, by this time, for this much money, and for whatever purpose it is, right? So because if you're translating advertisements, then they have to be advertised, use advertisements elsewhere, then you have to create an advertisement that works as an advertisement. So the reason why it's being done is to be told to you, and how much money you'll be paid, and when it is due. So translation as an activity is, you can see broadly, when you look at it commercial terms, it's always a transaction. The publisher paying you money, paying you in advance, getting the book translated by a particular time, to the satisfaction of whoever, right? Maybe the publishers, editors, whatever, or if the author is alive, to the author's satisfaction. And that, I will come to that again later on. But if you choose something yourself, and How did you choose it? How did that book come to your attention? What is the market like that book? Which market gave you that book? Is it because it is academically important and you read it in an academic situation? Why was it academically important? How was it canonized? How was it on a syllabus? How was it even suggested to you? What role, what transactions have taken place there that it has come to you in the first place, right? And then when you start reading it, you're actually, your the way it's been presented to you has an influence on the way you read the book, and the way you read the book has an influence then on the way you translate the book or translate the story or a poem or whatever you're translating at that point. And why you want to translate it, just because you like it, or is that saying something that you want somebody else who speaks or reads only in the other language to know? What is it that you want to do in that language? What do you want this thought process to do to that language and readers of that language? What is the transaction that you want that your translated book to be having with the reader of the book? And what is the transaction that you're actually having with the book itself that you're translating? Right. So it's always a series of transactions that you have to unpack, unravel to understand clearly why you're doing what you're doing, which is translation. It's not simply I'll pick a book and translate. What is the thing? I just go pick up any book. This was lying on the sidewalk. I just picked it up and I'm translating it. It doesn't happen like that. But you read it in any case before you translate it. Though, of course, again, interesting translators I've seen. Some are very domestic in the sense of not. I'm going back 2 generations to my grandfather, who used to be sitting with the English newspaper and reading it out. As he was reading it, he would read it out in Tamil for my grandmother who didn't read English. And he would read it. He was actually translating it. It's kind of oral translation, if you want, which is called interpretation. And he was reading it aloud as he was reading it. That's a wonderful gift. He would read it in a different language altogether, right? But again, in the nature of what was happening here, to give information to his wife, to make her see the world the way he was seeing it, because it also come with a commentary. He would be giving a commentary on the news reports that he was reading. And it would be interesting for us to see that he's actually reading it, interpreting it, but he's also then interpreting it, giving a commentary. All transactional. His interaction with the newspaper, with his wife. So it's not simply in business terms of looking at it, though as I said, we can look at it in business and commercial terms. It is also in ways of how we influence each other with translation. If you think, all right, that I'm not seriously talking about literary translation, and that is what you expected from me, okay, I'll give you a bit about my experience of translation, because that was the question raised. So I shall address that question as I talk about my experience of translating Imbibe's A Red-Necked Green Bird, which is my English title for it, which is quite a clear translation of the Tamil title. I'm not deviated from it at all. When you translate a book, obviously when an author is alive, you express an interest to the author, that you like the works, her other work as well, and that you'd like to translate this if she thinking of having it published. And especially a writer like Imbibe, who's always been translated in English, and you say, you think I can do this? And there's a back and forth that goes on, right? And the author agrees, a publisher agrees, you have a contract, all transactions. And then you start. And that's where it gets very interesting. If the author is alive, when you're translating, and Imbibe, may God bless her with a very long life, with Imbibe, C.S. Lakshmi, what would happen with C.S. Lakshmi was that she would read every word that I had written. She would read every word that I'd written. She would have her own views on, because as far as she's concerned, she's written the Tamil version, the language I'm translating from. It's easy to have a position where you say, I understand it's a different language. I understand that it has to be done differently in that language. I understand you are another person. You're a translator who is interpreting the book, reading it, finding meanings, your own emphases, and you're writing that as translation. It's easy to understand that at a particular level, but it's difficult when comparing two works, and especially, as I said, difficult for the writer of the first work, but difficult for most readers who can read both languages. They can theoretically grant this, but they cannot practically grant this to a translator. When they look at the practice, for most readers, if you read your Bengalis and you read translations in English from Bengali or in Hindi, which if you're bilingual in other languages, you read in that language, your first impulse would be to take away every license given to a translator, every understanding you have theoretically, but simply say, no, wrong, because this word has been translated like this sentence has been translated like this, it's all wrong. You just pick out mistakes. You know it's a translation, but you want completely every word in the original text should be translated in the way you want it to be done. The transaction between the translator and the text is of one kind, the translator and the author is of another kind, and the text and the reader is a third level. And in each one of this, the translator will think she's doing a job which is, in a sense, a pleasure, but also a faithful reproduction of her or his reading of the text. Reading of the text. That's a crucial thing, right? How I read the story. What do I see? And for the author, author will be looking at the translation in terms of whether it is a reenactment, a re-performance, a writing in another language of her story, the way she wrote the story, what she thinks of the story. Will it be that? So the reader reading the story, the interesting thing is a reader who does not know the language of the original, which is who you think you're translating for. But there may be readers who are bilingual who will then look for the translation to be the same as their reading, the reader's reading of the original. So they'll be reading the text to find out whether it carries across what they as good readers have felt. And readers who don't know the original language will be reading the translation to see if it reflects, if it's loyal to, if you want, their other reading about the writer, or whether it works. Others will, if they're not of academic interest, orientation, others will be reading it simply to see if it is a pleasure to read it and works like a story in their own language, a novel in their own language. It's such a complex overall system, and I'm not even touching every bit, but it's a complex system. You can read reviews of a red-necked green bird and see how they agree on some things, they disagree on some things completely. How people like the translation, how people dislike the translation. It's interesting, right? And what they like and what they dislike. And when people know the original language, how do they review? And when people don't know the original language, what are they saying? when people have read other texts by the same writer in English translation from other translators, what do they bring to this? So when we talk about literary translation, also the other thing that to address the question, because I said I will, because one knows the various kinds of transactions that take place, which is what theory makes you aware of in the way you read language, the way you use language, the way words carry across, the ways in which each knowledge system, each language is a knowledge system, how in a sense translation should be impossible, but it is possible, we still do it because each language is a complete different knowledge systems. How do you actually can carry across a completely closed worldview, a certain world into another world, right? But you do it. Very often, I say this, it's possible. People talk about proximate languages. I think proximate languages in your mind as well, right? So if you are at home in English, if you're at home in Tamil, if you're at home in Hindi, you're already you have a system where in your brain where you're moving from one language to another. So the boundaries are very porous. You move from one language to another. As Professor Trivedi said in a talk the other day, and he was talking about how we are we are incompetent in most languages. We start talking in one language in India. Many of us who are supposedly multilingual, we cannot finish in that language. We end up finishing in some other language altogether, which is true that for many of us, we shift from one language to another. We know that, and it's very difficult to stick to one language completely in a given, and only in a very specific artificial situation do we actually stay with one language in a classroom. But even there, as I said, people shift from English in the teaching English literature to the local language, wherever you are. So I don't, so far as I see, there is the thing about languages coming together in my mind. Why it helps me is when I'm looking at writing from where there is a language interaction also taking place, because there can be no pure language anywhere. There is no pure space anywhere where there is no interaction with any other language. So if I see that, if I recognize that there are various languages which are impinging on the language that I'm reading anyways, and the writer is himself is a reader, himself is reading, is being influenced by other languages, other cultures. It's easier for me as a translator, once I see that no text is born without any influence, right? There is no such birth that takes place. That there are interventions, there is a lot of influence from other cultures, other literary texts, other media, that all that goes into the birth of text now, of a text, of anything that people write or perform. It's coming from different kinds of influences and histories, different traditions, and are there, and it's a question of performing it with that complexity in mind. And that you're able to do because your brain is already doing it every day. If you're in a completely monolingual situation where everybody else speaks the same language, where you're so culturally closed off that you hear no other music, you see no other dance, you see nothing else. I can't imagine such a situation, really speaking. But if there was such a situation, that translator, having studied some of the languages, a foreign language, will find it difficult to get it across. Right? Get across a complex text from outside, which is multilingual, which has had all kinds of impact on it. Difficult to get that across. You have to, as a translator, you have to know that life is full of such interactions around you and be ready to read this. Where does theory come in here? Theory allows you to think about translation. Theory allows you to think about translation. Theory allows you to think about the frames that are available for translation, or ways of reading translation, ways of transacting business, if you want, with your readers. Who are your readers? Think what kind of, why am I translating? Am I just translating myself? What am I doing with that? What do I mean by that? People like me, what do I mean by that? What kind of, how broad is my readership? How much do you think they know? All kinds of things go on in your head. And then you, because you're theoretically involved with the act of translation, you are able to take positions and think about it. Does it help you to translate? No. Theory will not help you to translate, but theory will help you to understand your processes of translation, why you're translating, how you're translating, how are you making your choices, what is your positioning, what is the ideology as a translator. These you understand. These you understand. So is there an easy way of doing theory and translating? No. In fact, the better way would be to translate and then theorize, and then understand theory and read theory, right? Read more theory. Because if you're not translated, and then thought about it, theory stands apart. It's not easily digested. You need to translate in order to understand theory, and then in order to theorize. So that's what the connection between translation and theory there is. It's again, as I said, because you know theory, you understand what transactions you're involved in. So, sorry, I'm getting distracted somewhere here. So how much time do I have still? Okay, I have about 5 more minutes, because I've been told that we should have and I really want a question answer session. I want to hear what students think. All right. We can see the way, as I said, we have people here who do Indian English literature. And we know how English is evolving in our country, in different parts of our country, how various languages have an impact on the English we speak, and the English many of us write. We don't need to look down, judge. We just need to accept it. That's how it is. And very often our languages not just have an impact on each other, including on English and English on our languages, they're also in conflict. And that has an impact on us, the way we think. This morning, I was reading the newspaper about a Tamil MP complaining that when a question was asked in English, the minister was replying in Hindi. And because the minister was replying in Hindi, there was a furor saying English questions posed in English should be answered in English. There was a supplementary question asked in Tamil, which too the minister answered in Hindi. The interesting thing about supplementary questions being asked in Tamil is that if anybody wants to pose a question in the parliament, a question which is not in English or Hindi, you need to give prior notice to the parliament secretariat, and they would try and find a translator and then an interpreter, and then the question can be asked and it'll be interpreted. For Hindi and English, it's not a problem. They have interpreters. So the minister's thing was, I answer in Hindi, you're listening to the interpretation in English, what's your problem? I will answer in Hindi. There is always this question in this country of hegemony of languages over others. You know this. And I'm not just talking about how southern states think the Hindi is being imposed on them. No. Think of a history. Think of Bengali Odia, Bengali Assamese, various northeastern languages. I'm just going down the coast there. and then if you go for Tamil and Kannada, so you can actually see that there is always it's an always a political question, always a political question as to whether you want to hold on to a linguistic purity and separation, or do you want languages to mingle with each other? Does one language become hegemonic, and do people have to, what happens to people? Just to give you a quick example of translational transactions, if you want, Arunachal Pradesh, they speak to each other. The lingua franca there is Hindi. Why? Because they speak 200 odd mutually unintelligible languages. Why do they speak in Hindi? And the answer was given by a wonderful writer. The answer was because it is not Assamese. They speak Hindi because it's not Assamese, because Assamese was seen as the hegemonic language there. But they didn't replace it with English. They replaced it with another Indian language, Hindi. It's an interesting political choice. So when you start looking at such decisions everywhere, why do people do what they do? What is their attitude to language? What is the language they use in everyday life? What is the kind of language they speak? And India gives you so much when you start thinking about this. We just have to think of our own situation to realize that all of us are not just translated. All of us are translated, but all of us are translators. And all of them are involved in translational transactions. What do we take? What do we give? What do we not take? What do we leave? What we don't do any longer? There's so much. And you'll realize, you'll think about it, from dress codes to food to so many things that we change, give up, adopt, and we have an impact. Because there is this whole row, I'm not going to the row that's and the kind of riots that are happening, but I just want, I like, when I'm thinking about translation, I like to think of clothes. And one of the things that has always struck me, and I talk about it because people, if you've not been my age, won't know this. When Tamil Nadu, I used to go back for vacations from Delhi. I'm a Delhi person. So when we used to go once in 2 years, once in 3 years, and the pressure on my sisters would be to dress conventionally out there and to wear what is called the pavade damani when they were younger. So you wear a long skirt, pavade, ghagra kind, and you wear a half sari, as we used to say it in English, damani, which was a transition to wearing a sari. My grandmother there, my other relatives there, frowned on my sisters wearing the salwar kameez, because they said a salwar kameez was form revealing, and therefore they thought it was immodest. Over the years, what the change that took place, that one can see visibly in Tamil Nadu, is that more and more women of every age, they are wearing now salwar kameezes. Why? Because the same women feel that the salwar kameez is a modest dress. Why? Because unlike the sari, unlike the half sari, the salwar kameez covers the skin completely. So when women going out and buses and things, so your skin is not showing at all when you're wearing a salwar kameez. Immodest earlier because it showed the figure. Modest later on because it showed no skin. It's an interesting adoption of a dress. Interesting to see the translation that's happening here. It's based on idea of women's going out more and more, running to catch a bus, strange men touching them. That happens everywhere in this country, except perhaps the Northeast. The harassment. So their reply, and one of the things I always felt was that in such a situation, the more you cover, the happier the women would be, because they're caught in this world where men just don't understand any limits, any boundaries. So it's, when you think of every time you talk, change your, want to change the kind of dress you wear, the kind of talk that you have to have in the family, the kind of fights that you have to have. I know, for example, when people try to had, in those days used to have what we call a kudmi, a choti, which people have again now. They call it man buns or whatever. At that time, to cut your hair was seen as completely wrong, sacrilege. And what went through, what people went through to, what kind of transactions that took place. Question of, are you being modern? Are you not being modern? Are you being traditional? Are you being, all these are open to transaction. As a friend here who is a Pandit used to say, Jaisa desh, vaisa besh. So you disguise yourself, you appear as, do as, it's the equivalent of when in Rome, do as the Romans do. We are always in translational situations, because either because of time, or because of others' impact on you, or because of place, because you moved somewhere else. There's nothing that's static about it. And they're all based on various kinds of transactions. I'm sorry, because I know I will not be told time is up. It is 12:54. So I think I should stop. I hope what I've said is to at least touch the tip of the iceberg. I know there's so much more I could do with this topic. I know you have so much to, must have already thought of so much you could do with this topic. I know, that since I talk about theater, since I talk about language, since I talk about normally about, as I said, theater, language, and in English, I've done the Indian English bit. I referred to it. Referred to, but in terms of theater, I basically picked up idea of costume, the idea of decor, the surroundings we live in, the kind of houses you can go, because our houses are translated spaces in any case. So we can carry on. I hope I've just, done enough to make you all think. And I hope I've said enough for at least one or two of you to ask or to further the discussion. I think I should stop here. Thank you very, very much. If anyone is speaking, I can't hear. And if you could hear me, I have stopped.
I guess there's a issue from their side. There is microphone glitch.
I think there are many questions in the chat box. If someone can read them out.
Yes.
Wonderful, yeah.
Yes, Munjima. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Ma'am, shall I begin the Q&A session? Yes, yes. Thank you. There's the,
I
yeah,
can,
please do that.
yes. Thank you, ma'am. A very
Can
good
you hear
afternoon.
me, Munjima?
Yes, ma'am, I can.
Oh, okay. Then let me introduce Munjima sir to you and to all of our students. She is a PhD researcher from Bankura University. She has been researching the angst of masculinity and through drag performances from a comparative perspective in Indian performance traditions and in the US. So this is her research topic, and she is going to moderate the question and answer session. And sir, if you can hear us, can
Yes,
you?
yes.
Okay. Oh, that is so relieving. I really thank you, sir. On behalf of all of us, we thank you for a beautiful lecture that seemed to me that seems simple, but it is very resonant and layered. And I will now hand it over to Munjima to please conduct the question and answer session. Munjima, please read out those questions.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much. A very good afternoon to all my seniors, my fellow scholars, and my juniors. Thank you, sir, for such a wonderful session. I would like to read out two questions. Um, yes, there are more questions, but there are two questions asked by Mridula. I'm really sorry, I do not know her surname. So, her first question is, in the beginning, sir, you mentioned that if a translation resembles the original text, it fails to remain a translation. Can we transcribe, if not translate, a text from one language to another while maintaining a loyal commitment to the source text? One where originality gets reproduced? If you consider this to be a viable possibility, where do you think we can accommodate a process like this in larger conversations on linguistic transactions? This is our first question.
Right. Very interesting question. But and it also asked me what I meant by that. Right. So obviously, if a translation is the same as original, then it's the same language, it's the same text. So obviously, in a certain sense, the transaction that has taken place is physical. I've taken a book and carried to a different country or to a different house or a different room, and I say, oh, here's the translation. The same text. Right. That's what I meant by saying if it's the same as original, it's not a translation. It's original. It's that text that you were taking across. Right. And this leads to interesting questions in terms of script in one of the that she's asking. If I read a Urdu text and then I write it in Devanagari script, not changing a single word, right? And it is mostly intelligible to a non-Urdu speaking Hindi reader. Very few words will challenge the reader, and that a dictionary can help with. Is this change of script a translation? This is change of script a translation, right? And the other way around. Is this change of script a translation? When you transliterate, when you're speaking in Bengali to me, and it's being written down in Roman for me to be able to read it aloud. Of course, Roman script may not be able to reproduce all the Bengali sounds, but transliteration of that kind, and many people will actually do it in Devanagari because in India, because they feel Devanagari has more sounds and it can be express more sounds, and it's closer to what is being spoken. But when I'm reading it aloud, is there an understanding? Do I know what it means? Do I know what these sounds mean? You know this because very often when you are bullying, not bullying, when you're ragging, even relatives from other language communities who come into your through marriage into your family, friends who don't know the language who come, and you teach them words, telling them they mean other things than they actually mean, and they use them in the wrong situations, and there's a lot of laughter around. You know that they get the sound right. They got the sound right because you even wrote it for them so that they can get the sound right, but they didn't know what it means, right, at all, because you gave them the wrong meaning and they have no idea what it means. So in a sense, therefore it is transliteration translation, right? It is translation only if the two languages are so close that it's only a question of being able to read the script. That's why I said Urdu and Hindi. It's only a question of being able to read the script. I'm sure there are other languages like this, which are so close to each other that if just one could know the script, read that language in the script that one knows, one will be able to read, right? But again, what translation takes place there? That transliteration works as translation because the two languages are so close to each other that if people spoke in those languages to each other, they don't understand each other, that they would understand each other. It's only the written script that is the block. The language itself does not create another blocks. The spoken versions are very, very, very close to each other, right? So these are interesting cases in terms of translation, right? Otherwise, I would say that when you translate, automatically there will be changes. And of course, even now, even supposing a Tamilian like me, I know, who knows Hindi, the Devanagari script, reads an Urdu text in the Devanagari script, is come fresh from Tamil Nadu, and from a completely non-Muslim background as well. This is not just, and I must say, this doesn't have to do with religion at all. It has to do with actually with locations, right? So forget the non-Muslim. I come from Tamil Nadu. I'm a Muslim too. Whatever, it doesn't matter. I know I can read Hindi, the Devanagari script. I'm reading this Urdu text. There's so many things I will not understand. So many things that will not make any sense to me. I mean, people have told me again and again in translation classes that sometimes a particular word in the Urdu text belongs so specifically to a certain area that others who know Urdu don't understand that word or the way it's been used, right? So question of interpretation, right, is paramount there. That the word written in a different script, even for people reading that language, the word written in a different script to someone who doesn't know the area at all but can read the script, and even if the languages are close, I think there is a translation has taken place which takes the text away from the original meaning and setting, because the person reading it is reading in terms of a completely different place that they come from, right? So it's difficult. Even the special cases also have slippages, but otherwise simply change the script is, I would just say, a very unique case of translation, right? And very limited in terms of what we think of in terms as translation. Is it a transaction? Yes.
Thank you, sir. This person has asked another question. I would like to rephrase it a little bit because it is a bit long. Nonetheless, translators engage with a text written in a language with which they are not familiar. Using secondary sources, they attempt to build a dialogue with the source text and translate it into a language in which they are fluent. How does such a process unsettle institutionally legitimate forms of translation? Does it rupture the relationship that a translator is expected to have with the source text? If yes, how does one navigate it?
Again, a lovely complex question. Even the first one, I'm still thinking of how else I could answer it. Again, a very complex question, right? Why? Because my reality is different. My reality is different because, let's put it, forget my reality. The way people think about translations can be very different from what has been said here. Let's put it like that, right? People reading a text in a language which may not be alien to them. Translators may not be reading texts that they're translating, in terms of literary translation especially, that is alien to them. In terms of technical, non-scientific text, then this problem does not arise at all, right? Of not being culturally moved in the other language texts, etc. In science and in tender documents and commercial documents, this is not the problem at all. In terms of literary translation, yes, you need to know the culture very, very well. Can you get it through secondary text? I'm not sure. I'm not sure you can, right? So if I'm reading Tamil, unless I know Tamil well enough, right, I will not be able to simply look for augmentation from other sources in order to be able to translate from Tamil. There's so many things that are just not going to come through at all, right, in the first place. So I don't think it's easy to translate from something simply depending on secondary sources in the first place, right? Otherwise, you can simply talk about inspired by my reading of a language I'm not completely conversant with. It can't be a translation. I read a language, I read criticism on the text, and I read something without, I don't know the language too well, but I receive it with some critical apparatus. I like the idea, then I write it in the language I'm comfortable in. Is it a translation of the text? No. It is perhaps a translation in that sense of writing something that has influenced you, from something that's influenced you. That's about it, right? So normally when you translate, you need to be comfortable. That's why I said when I think about translation, I think of translating between two languages, both of which I'm comfortable in. I may not, and the only concession, because I'm thinking of myself personally, I may not be creatively competent in the language I'm translating from. I'm critically competent. I can read it, I understand it completely. Do I write in it? Will I create in it? I don't, right? But I'm creatively competent and critically competent in the language I'm translating into. That's the only difference. That the level of competence, the slight difference. But if I cannot read that text comfortably, then I'm sorry. I don't think I'm translating them at all.
All right, sir. Thank you. The next question is asked by Deep Noshkar. He has asked, like he would like to know that in certain languages there are certain concepts which don't have a counterpart in another language. For instance, kokoro in Japanese doesn't have an exact counterpart in English. How should a translator address it, and how much essence of the original work is lost in an attempt to translate it?
One of the things I said was each language is a complete system in itself, a worldview. It creates, people say that your language gives you your world. It's because of the language that you are using, you see the world in a particular way. And that other languages won't have that system, will not look at the world the same way, right? So as I said, translation, when you begins as an impossible task. It's an impossible task, right? No two languages are similar. No, if they were shared the whole worldview completely, and if they were part of the same culture, then very often they'll be the same language, right? So we are, can be a slight illusion, but slight movement, but you can see that the languages are very similar. That's why we keep saying, oh, between contiguous languages, translation is easy in India. So between Bengali and Odia will be easy translation. But between Bengali and something else altogether, let's say Marathi, it will not be that easy because you go further. But between Indian languages, it's easier anyway than between an Indian language and a European language. All this is really saying we can get around it because you don't need to be a contiguous language. I can go across India and still translate. I know that terms are different. I know the meanings, the impact of the terms are different. But in any case, people struggle and have to struggle. And so not in a bad way, in a good way, in a struggle, because that's what you got to do. You got to work at understanding each other. All of us have to work at understanding each other, even when we speak the same language, because in our country, as elsewhere, there are class differences. And in our country, not just religious differences, caste differences, they're completely different lifestyles, completely different religious connotations, practices. Are you, even the latest controversy, was he blowing air? Was he spitting? What do they mean? So many things we have, which we need to understand, to go across, to make an effort to understand, right? as I said, if we are aware of this, that we have to understand, we have to make the effort, right? It's always an act that we have to do consciously, right? Then this business of translation becomes easier, because you are saying, all right, I will not be able to use a term, but can I find a way of explaining without, in a literary text, losing the reader, because the reader wants to read fluently, to read without stopping because you're explaining something, right? Without the expense of the narrative. Should I do it? How do I do it? All right. That's what you do. That's what you do. You try and explain, you try and include in the text. Otherwise, if you find you cannot, then you give up. Then you can't translate this, right? But if you can embed it so well that people can understand it, go ahead, do it, right? And sometimes we sometimes do this, that people should get nuances and should know it's very nuanced. We sometimes use the original term itself in the translated text. So there'll be a Japanese term, because you know then that you're reading something which is so different that the translator simply has put that in. And then the situations as they come on and you use other terms and get back to that term, people slowly start understanding that what it could mean, what the impact of that. But again, these are all translation strategies. It's up to the translator to decide how to go about it. And the last thing is, people talk about this, have said often enough this, there's a term called compensation. So when there's something you cannot do, you try to do it somewhere else, in a particular, you try and augment it somewhere else, right? But any strategy that you use, it will work, should work. And you can get it tested by asking people to read it and see if it works.
Thank you so much, sir. I think this is the last question that I will be reading, ma'am. I guess we can take another question.
Of course, it is absolutely up to you, Munjima. This question is yours. If you think another question can be taken. Yes.
All right. So this is a question asked by Onamika Mohanta. She wants you, sir, to elaborate on the cultural nuances of a particular language and how the translator can imbibe the same in the target language so that the reader experience the flavor of it.
These are, again, decisions that a translator has to take for herself, right? There is no set rule. There is no set rule that this is what you do. This is one of the things that you discover when you're translating. You say, all right, there are certain things I can do in the language I'm translating into, which does get across the fact that that this is a translated text. It's from a different culture. It should not be read simply as a text coming from an English speaking world. So what do I do to make sure it's not just not an English speaking world? It is an Odia speaking world. It is a Tamil speaking world. It's a Malayalam speaking world. How do I do this? And without losing the reader, without irritating the reader, what do I do? Right? And you can want to make the reader aware all the time also. That's also a different decision. I don't care if the reader is irritated. It's a different world. And the reader has to make the effort, and I'm going to make sure the reader makes the effort. Fair enough. So you can actually have terms from a different language. You can have music if it's being used. Basically, it's a referential world of the first text. So the referential world of the first text, how much of it can you transfer to your second text, the language you're writing in, right? If you are addressing a reader who has the same or similar referential world in your head, it becomes easier. People speaking two different languages in this country, reading two different languages within India, including in English I'm saying. So if you say people who speak Tamil share a certain referential world with people across the country who may be reading my English. Right? How much do they share? How much can I presume? How much can I use? Right? So, but this is a business of every creative writer as well. It's not just a translator's business. If you're writing in India, in English, for example, I'm taking English because I'm thinking that's the language I translate into. So if somebody is writing in English in this country, how can they assume how much others in this country, I'm not talking about the world, how much others in this country who are reading English can understand about a specific location and that world of references there? Right? Is there a hard and fast rule? No. It's a trial and miss method. You do some things. If it works, it works. It doesn't, it doesn't. This is for creative writers as well. So for them, the first readers are the editors who read it. And editors may say, this doesn't work, can you change it? This term doesn't work, and we don't want footnotes. So what do? Can you change this term? Right? So there are, or can you kind of write a couple of lines which kind of don't disturb the narrative, but explain this better, right? And so reader doesn't feel alienated completely. I think that's the choice, same choice the creative writer in English makes in India, the same choice a translator into English in India makes the same choices. Hard and fast rule? No. But one hard and fast rule, which is hegemonic, is that very often Hindi terms, and if you can get in a Hindi reference as an equivalent to the reference from Odia or Bengali or whatever word reference, you use in English, it's very often intelligible across because people have started expecting, Hindi in a certain way and reading Hindi in a certain way. All right. But again, I will not offer this as an advice to everybody because we were talking about it. When I talk, certain ideas come to me and I said, oh yes, we know that Indian English, Hindi is acceptable, more acceptable than any other language within Indian English, right? More intelligible, more acceptable, whatever. But again, it depends on who's reading it, no? So I would not say there is a hard and fast rule, but I would say you try your damn best.
Thank you so much, sir. I think that was the last question for this session, and I would request ma'am to um, take over and conclude. Thank you. Thank you so much.
If you're saying something, we can't hear you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Monjima. Thank all of us, in fact, we researchers who have asked questions here, and Monjima for so gracefully conducting the session. And sir, I now realize that even in my new role, as what should one say, the administrative keeper of the department, I find I'm in a constant translational space. It means a space of discomfort, I think, as I have learned from you, a space of constantly engaging with multiple views, an act of imagination, an act of generosity, an act of attention, and a world of possibilities and unlearnings. Your lecture and the questions that came, and I could not be there all the time, and I was busy there, but my attention had to drift at some moments. But I thought all that you said, most of it would lead down alleys of many more explorations, understandings. Every origin lies in a land of translations, I thought when I heard you. I would now invite Professor Gautam Buddha Shural, our colleague and senior professor in this department. Without the help of this department, of course, this event cannot be. It is tautological. But I would invite him to please give the vote of thanks. So we cannot thank you enough for you are a translator and generous as a translator should be.
Thank you, Ipsita. And as you have requested me to offer the vote of thanks,
Yes,
my First, thanks from the core of my heart goes to Professor for such an engaging talk. And I think the questions actually point to the fact that how engaging the talk was. I also thank the registrar of our university. Along with the registrar, I thank the university community, especially our colleagues within and outside the department, some of whom had gone out of their way to suggest, aid, improvise, and improve. A special thanks to the people in the canteen, because for Sir, these words are particularly meant for Professor Prasad, that as they were listening to your talk, they were being entertained by the chicken pot, which is again and that is actually the brainchild of Ipshita, definitely. And then I also thank the non-teaching staff of our department, particularly, who are a constant help in such such programs, and our students and our researchers. We thank them all on behalf of the department. So I think if anybody is left out, while I offer the thanks from on behalf of the department, I beg pardon for that. And I now request Ipshita to formally conclude the session.
So thank you very much. It was a morning when many of us came alive also. I mean, we were living, we had spent this morning living. And thank you very much. So shall we conclude the session now?
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Okay, sir. Right. Yes, I hope to have you sometime here. We all hope to have you sometime at Bankura, you know.
Yes. I'd love to do that. I'd love to interact with students.
Yes, and this is a land of translations that might also have something of interest for you too, sir. And we would, of course, love to have you here. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all.